They said it was just a blizzard, that nothing could survive out there. Not a child, not a dog, and certainly not a lion. But deep in the snow-covered woods of Snow Creek, something was waiting, not for food, not for rescue, but for something greater. A lion cub, barely able to stand, had wrapped his trembling body around a whimpering puppy, shielding it from the cold with what little strength he had left. And when Grace found them, she didn't just see two animals, she saw a miracle. What happened next would awaken a boy who hadn't spoken in 2 years, and remind a broken mother that some angels have fur, and some prayers are answered in the quiet, before we begin this true story of faith, healing, and wild redemption. Would you tell us where you're watching from in the comments? And if stories like this touch your heart, leave a quiet amen below, and don't forget to like and subscribe. Before we begin this unforgettable story, would you mind sharing where you're from in the comments, and if stories of love, loyalty, and second chances move you? Please give this video a like and consider subscribing. Snow Creek, Colorado, was a town carved by wind and silence, where pine trees stood like ancient guardians and winters blanketed everything in thick, white stillness. That night, the air was restless. A blizzard had rolled in from the north, cloaking the mountain trails and bending the evergreens under the weight of fresh snow. The wind howled like a wounded thing through the narrow valleys, sending flurries spinning against windows and whistling under doors. Grace Reynolds, 39 years old, stood in her kitchen, stirring a mug of chamomile tea she barely intended to drink. She had shoulder-length auburn hair tied back in a messy braid and tired blue eyes that hadn't known peace since the accident. Tall and willowy, Grace moved with a quiet grace that masked the turbulence within. Once a best-selling children's author, she had retreated to this small wooden cottage on the edge of Snow Creek's forest after the death of her husband in a car crash 2 years prior. Since then, she'd written nothing but half-finished sentences and stared too long at the snow. The house was quiet except for the crackling of the fireplace and the occasional shifting of wood beams under the storm's pressure. Her 12-year-old son, Finn, had gone to bed early. He had sandy brown hair, thin-framed glasses, and a gentle face that often looked far away. Diagnosed with autism at the age of 6, Finn was a boy of few words but immense feeling. The loss of his father had sealed his world further inward. He rarely spoke, rarely left the house, and communicated mostly through drawings when he chose to draw at all. Grace wrapped her shawl tighter and walked to the window, watching the snow fall sideways across the porch light. That's when she heard it, barely audible at first. A sharp whimper, thin and desperate, carried on the wind. She froze, uncertain. Then it came again. Not the wind, not an echo. Something real, something crying. Her instincts stirred, pulling on her long coat and thick winter boots. Grace grabbed a flashlight, hesitated for a heartbeat, and stepped outside. The cold slapped her face like open palms. The wind cut through her layers as she trudged through the snow, flashlight beam shaking in her gloved hand. The sound had come from near the tree line, where the forest pressed close against the property's edge. The light flickered across buried shrubs and frozen bark, then stopped. Under the skeletal branches of a crooked spruce, hunched low in the snow, was a creature she couldn't quite comprehend at first. A cub, yes, but not a bear, and too regal in shape. Tawny gold fur dusted with snow, a thick fluffy mane just beginning to form around the head, limbs too large for its body, and eyes too large for its face. It was a lion cub. He couldn't have been more than 6 or 7 months old. One hind leg was bent unnaturally, likely fractured or sprained. His breath came in visible puffs, rapid and shallow. But it wasn't just him. Curled beneath his chest was a much smaller animal, a white puppy, barely 2 months old, pressed tightly into the lion's warmth. The puppy had curly fur, a pink nose, and one ear that flopped sideways. Its whines were faint but rhythmic. It was shivering violently, and the lion cub, injured, freezing, far from any place he should have been, was sheltering the pup with his own body. Grace's breath caught in her throat. Her first instinct was fear. Wild animal, danger. But the cub didn't growl. He didn't run. He simply looked at her. There was something in that gaze, not challenge, not defiance, something closer to pleading. Grace knelt slowly, keeping the flashlight aimed away from their eyes. "Hey, it's okay," she whispered, her voice more breath than sound. "I won't hurt you." The lion cub didn't move. Grace set the flashlight on the snow, reached behind her into her coat pocket, and pulled out her wool scarf. She inched forward, heart pounding, and gently placed the scarf over the puppy. The cub watched, tense but still. With great care, Grace gathered the puppy into her arms. It was barely conscious. Then she held out the scarf like an invitation. And to her astonishment, the lion cub limped forward, just a step, and leaned into the warmth of the fabric. Grace shifted her weight, supporting him with her free arm as best she could. He was heavier than she'd expected, but not unmanageable. She carried them both back to the house through the storm. Inside, she laid them down near the fireplace. She fetched a folded quilt from the couch and placed it around the lion. The pup stirred, nose twitching. The lion cub kept his eyes on Grace but did not move again. Later, as the fire crackled and the storm raged outside, Grace crouched near them with a bowl of warm water and a few strips of cooked chicken. She spoke softly, though she wasn't sure if it was for their sake or her own. "I don't know where you came from," she murmured, "but maybe you're meant to be here." The lion sniffed the water but didn't drink. The pup licked the chicken cautiously. Neither of them seemed ready to sleep, so Grace stayed with them, resting against the armchair, her eyes flickering to the flames and back to the creatures now sharing her home. And so, on a night when the snow buried everything and the world seemed entirely still, a woman, a lion cub, and a tiny white puppy, three beings each carrying their own quiet sorrow, found warmth together. And though none of them knew it yet, that moment was the beginning of something none of them had dared hope for. The morning after the storm, sunlight filtered weakly through the frosted windows of Grace's cottage, casting soft golden beams onto the living room floor. The blizzard had passed, leaving behind a white silence that blanketed the town of Snow Creek. The forest outside shimmered under the weight of fresh snow. And inside, the fire in the hearth had burned down to glowing embers. Grace sat cross-legged on a cushion near the fireplace, a steaming cup of coffee in hand, watching the two animals resting just a few feet away. The lion cub was curled into himself, his back legs still stiff but no longer trembling. His fur, matted from snow and cold, had started to fluff back into its golden luster, thanks to the warmth of the room and the towel Grace had gently dried him with the night before. His amber eyes blinked slowly, tracking her every move without fear. Beside him, nestled under the same quilt, was the little white puppy. Grace had given him a warm bath early that morning and dried him with one of Finn's old baby blankets, now that the mud and cold were washed away. He looked no older than 8 weeks. His fur was soft and curly, his paws oversized for his frame. He would grow into a medium-sized dog, perhaps a poodle mix or labradoodle. The pink in his nose was starting to deepen with warmth, and his tail gave a lazy wag each time Leo shifted. It was clear now. Leo, though wild by nature, had adopted the little dog as his own. Grace could see it in the way the lion curled protectively around him in sleep and nuzzled the puppy's fur gently when he stirred. There was no dominance, no feral tension, only quiet guardianship, as if the cub had been born to watch over something smaller than himself. Grace stood and stretched, the aches of the night before still lingering in her shoulders. She padded quietly down the hallway toward Finn's room and knocked lightly before entering. Finn Reynolds, 12 years old, sat on his bed, his back pressed against the wall, a blanket drawn up to his chest. He was already awake, staring at the frosted window with a distant expression. His dark blue pajama top was wrinkled from sleep, and his hair stuck up slightly on one side. Beside him was his sketch pad, a thick one with a worn navy blue cover, and a set of colored pencils. Grace noticed he hadn't picked them up in months. "Morning, sweetheart," she said gently. Finn didn't respond. He rarely did in the mornings, and Grace was used to his silence. She offered him a small smile. "Would you like to meet the guests?" He blinked slowly but made no movement. Grace didn't press him. They're in the living room. One of them is a lion cub, she said, trying to sound light. A real one. That caught his attention. Finn turned toward her, eyes wide, brows knitting. He didn't speak, but he shifted the blanket down slightly as if preparing to get up. You don't have to, Grace added quickly. Only if you want to. Finn nodded, barely, and Grace stepped aside, back in the living room. Leo had shifted positions, now lying flat with his head resting on the puppy's back. The puppy was awake, tail thumping lightly on the floor. As Grace returned, she noticed Finn standing hesitantly in the doorway, his eyes fixed on the lion. It's okay, Grace said softly. They're calm. Finn stepped forward slowly, eyes flicking between Grace and the cub. The puppy let out a soft yip and, to Grace's surprise, patted over to Finn with a gentle bounce. The boy dropped to his knees as the puppy placed its paws on his leg and licked his wrist. Finn gave a breathless sound, half laugh, half whisper, and ran his hand through the pup's fur. From behind, Leo stood, his body alert. Grace tensed. But then something remarkable happened. Leo limped forward, positioning himself slightly behind the puppy, and sat down. He didn't growl or bare his teeth. He simply watched. Finn looked up at Leo, his gaze held, and something unspoken passed between them. Finn reached slowly for the sketch pad he'd dropped and opened it across his knees, his fingers, still hesitant. Picked up a brown pencil. Grace watched in disbelief. The first line was shaky. Then came another. Finn's fingers moved faster. He was drawing. She didn't speak, didn't dare break the moment. Tears pricked the corners of her eyes as she backed into the kitchen to give them space. Later that afternoon, while the sun cast amber hues across the snow-drenched yard, Grace took the opportunity to clean the small guest room adjacent to the kitchen. It hadn't been used in over a year. Dust clung to the windowsill, and old books were still stacked on the floor, many of them children's picture books from her past life. She cleared out the floor, spread a soft rug, and placed a cushion by the heater. It would be a warm, quiet space, perfect for Leo and the puppy. By early evening, Finn had drawn 3 full pages, one of Leo sleeping, one of the puppy curled up in a ball, and one, Grace's favorite, of both of them looking up, as if waiting for someone to come home. As night fell, Grace sat down with Finn beside the fireplace. I think he needs a name, she said, pointing at the puppy. What do you think? Finn hesitated. Then, in the smallest voice she'd heard in months, he whispered, Buddy. Grace's breath caught. She smiled. Buddy. That's perfect. Leo, lying nearby, lifted his head as if acknowledging the name. Finn smiled too, brief but real. That night, Grace tucked Finn into bed and returned to the fireplace, where Leo lay beside Buddy, both dozing beneath the soft glow of the flames. The wind outside had softened. The room glowed with golden light. It was a quiet miracle, but a miracle nonetheless. The days in Snow Creek had taken on a still, glowing quietness. The blizzard that once raged through the forest had left behind a crystalline world of white, where each breath formed a cloud and every step crunched beneath the snow. Inside the Reynolds cottage, life had begun to move to a rhythm unlike any Grace had known before. Leo, the lion cub, was healing. His left hind leg, once too weak to hold his weight, was growing stronger. He could now walk without falling, though he still limped, each step deliberate and a bit uneven. But even with the limp, there was strength in him, and a strange grace that made it hard to remember he had once been curled up in the snow. Too cold to move, Grace had created a small pathway in the backyard for him, just wide enough for his paws, Buddy's bounding form, and Finn's boots. Every morning, just after breakfast, the three would head out. Finn would zip his coat up to his chin, pulling a knitted hat low over his ears, while Buddy ran in excited circles around him. Leo walked slowly, never straying far from the boy and the pup, his golden coat striking against the white ground, his breath rising in soft puffs into the air. Finn no longer flinched at the sight of Leo. On the contrary, he began to glance at the lion with a quiet familiarity, often lingering beside him, as if trying to understand what made this wild creature stay. Grace watched from the porch some mornings, heart aching at the sight of her son walking side by side with a lion cub as if it were the most natural thing in the world. At noon, they gathered in the living room, where a patch of sun always stretched out across the floor beneath the window. Grace brought out old comic books and picture stories, ones Finn used to love before silence took over his days. Finn would sit cross-legged on the floor with Buddy in his lap, and Leo resting his head on his front paws beside them. It started slowly. Finn would point at a panel and look at Buddy. "This one's funny," he whispered once. Grace had heard it from the kitchen and nearly dropped the mug she was rinsing. She didn't say anything. She didn't want to interrupt whatever magic was working itself out between the three of them. But from that day forward, the whispering continued, scattered phrases, small comments. Even a soft giggle now and then, when Buddy barked at a sound effect. Grace began writing again, not on her laptop, not stories, at least not yet. Just handwritten notes in an old leather-bound journal she hadn't opened in over a year. On the first page, she wrote, "Day 1, the lion walked behind my son today. It looked like he was guarding something precious." Each night, after Finn had gone to bed, she sat near the fireplace with the animals dozing nearby and jotted down what had happened during the day. She didn't think of it as writing a book, not at first. It was more like collecting pieces of something broken, her life, her voice, her heart, and setting them carefully in order. Buddy had become Finn's shadow, bounding ahead and circling back, pressing into his side as if to remind him, "I'm here, I'm listening." Leo remained the quiet guardian, never loud, never playful in the way Buddy was, but always watchful, always nearby. Sometimes, Finn would read to them both, and Grace would see the way Leo's ears twitched, the way Buddy rested his chin on Finn's knee, and she'd smile, not because it was extraordinary, but because it was so gently real. One evening, after Finn had fallen asleep with Buddy curled at his feet, Grace sat cross-legged on the rug and looked at Leo. He was lying near the fireplace, eyes half closed, his golden body warm in the firelight. "You've changed something," she said softly, not expecting an answer. In him, in me, too. Leo didn't move, but his amber eyes opened, and for just a moment, Grace could swear he understood. The morning had begun like any other in the snowy stillness of Snow Creek. The sun, pale and low, cast soft light across the yard, turning icicles into glass daggers that shimmered in the cold. Grace brewed coffee while Finn bundled up, Buddy bouncing at his feet. Leo, now stronger, though still limping slightly, waited patiently at the door. The three left just after breakfast, following the same path they'd worn into the snow over the past few weeks. Grace watched them from the porch as she always did, Finn's small figure between the bounding white dog and the steady golden lion. She didn't say it aloud, but she had grown to trust the rhythm of their little world. It was the kind of quiet trust that comes not from certainty, but from repeated days of peace. When they returned, she planned to bake cookies, oatmeal and raisin. Finn's favorite, even though he never admitted it. But the rhythm broke that evening. It started when Buddy returned alone. Grace had just lit the fire in the living room when she heard scratching at the door. She opened it expecting all three. Only Buddy stood there, whimpering, his white fur caked in snow and clinging in small clumps to his legs. His body was trembling, not from cold, but from fear. His eyes darted behind him, then up at Grace, as if begging her to understand. Grace's heart dropped. "Where's Leo?" Buddy let out a high-pitched yelp, turned around, then stopped, glancing back again. It was unmistakable. He wanted her to follow. "Finn," she called, her voice tight with panic. "Finn, come down, now." Finn appeared at the top of the stairs, clutching the railing, eyes wide. "Leo's not back," Grace said, "and Buddy's alone," before she could say anything else. Finn ran down the stairs, pulling on his boots and coat. Grace grabbed the flashlight and 2 extra scarves. She hesitated for just a second before handing one to Finn, wrapping it tightly around his neck. They followed Buddy into the forest, snow crunching underfoot, the trees pressing in like shadows. The flashlight beam bounced between branches and tracks, but the wind had begun to pick up again, scattering the paw prints, turning the world white and unfamiliar. Finn clutched her gloved hand tightly, his breathing sharp. "Leo," Grace called. "Leo, where are you?" There was no answer, only the sound of the wind through the trees and the occasional rustle of snow sliding off branches. Buddy suddenly barked and bolted ahead. Grace and Finn chased after him, stumbling over half-buried roots, hearts pounding. The dog stopped at a slope where a tree had cracked near the base, its thick branch, now broken and resting like a fallen arm, lay across a mound of snow, and beneath it was Leo. The lion cub was pressed low to the ground, his body curled protectively over something. As they came closer, Grace saw it, Buddy's paw, trapped under the broken branch. The puppy must have gone back out, gotten stuck, and Leo had stayed. All this time, he'd stayed. "Leo," Finn whispered. The lion raised his head. His amber eyes found Finn's in the dark. Grace knelt beside the branch, quickly inspecting it. "It's not too heavy," she murmured, more to herself than to Finn. "I can lift it. Buddy, hang in there." She wedged the flashlight into the snow and leaned into the branch, pushing with all her weight. It groaned but didn't budge. "I need help," she said. Finn didn't hesitate. He dropped to his knees and pushed beside her. Their boots slid in the snow. Their breath came in gasps. But the branch moved just enough for Buddy to wriggle free. As soon as the puppy was loose, Leo collapsed onto the snow, exhausted. His legs gave out beneath him. Leo Finn cried, and then, in a voice that cut through the wind and the snow and the forest itself, Finn shouted, "Leo." It was the first full sentence Grace had heard from him in nearly 2 years. The name came out with clarity, desperation, and something stronger than either, love. Grace froze. Tears burned her eyes as she turned to her son, who was now kneeling in the snow beside the lion, cradling Leo's head in his lap, whispering, "You waited, you stayed, you're okay." Buddy, limping slightly but alive, nestled close to them both, tail wagging weakly. That night, Grace led them all home. Leo was weak but alert, walking slowly beside them. She kept her flashlight pointed low, watching their steps in the white silence. The storm had passed, but the forest was still. No sound but the crunch of footprints. 4 sets now, close together, back at the house. Grace laid out every blanket they had by the fire. She made hot cocoa for Finn and warmed up broth for Leo, who lapped it with slow, grateful movements. Buddy lay beside the lion, his paw still sore, but eyes fluttering peacefully. Finn sat cross-legged between them, his cheeks red, eyes bright, hands never leaving Leo's fur. Grace didn't write that night. She just sat there and watched the miracle she never expected take shape before her eyes. The snow in Snow Creek began to melt slowly, reluctantly, like a long-held breath finally being released. Patches of brown earth peeked through the white, and the whisper of running water returned to the creeks. Bird song, quiet all winter, fluttered back into the trees like old friends. It was mid-March, and the season was shifting, not just outside, but within the small wooden house at the edge of the forest. Buddy had fully recovered. His once injured paw no longer favored the ground, and the little white and tan dog bounded through the mud and melt like a creature reborn. He had grown slightly taller, his coat now fluffed with health, his bark strong and cheerful. He followed Finn everywhere, including, finally, to school. It had taken many conversations, a visit from the principal, and a signed letter from a local vet for Buddy to become Finn's emotional support dog. But when Finn stepped onto the school bus that Monday morning in early spring, his hand resting gently on Buddy's collar, Grace stood on the porch with tears in her eyes. Finn didn't turn around, but Buddy did. Just once, before climbing into the bus as if he knew this moment mattered. Leo stayed behind. The lion cub, though no longer quite a cub, had grown into his lanky frame over the last few months. His once awkward limbs were now filled with quiet strength. His golden coat shimmered in the sunlight, and the slight limp remained, a mark of memory rather than weakness. Grace had built him a sheltered corner in the backyard with a wide platform of smooth wood and a sloped roof made of old cedar shingles. But more often than not, Leo chose to lie beneath the pines, his head held high, his eyes watching the trail that led to the school bus stop. He was the house's silent guardian. Grace's mornings were quieter now, but they had taken on new meaning. She had finished the manuscript 2 weeks after the night in the forest, after Finn had spoken Leo's name into the snow. She titled it, The Lion Who Waited. It wasn't a children's book, not really. It was part memoir, part fairy tale, part letter to a life she thought she had lost. She submitted it to a small publisher in Denver, one known for nature-focused titles and true life stories. She didn't expect much, but they loved it. The book was published in early May. By June, it had made its way into bookshops and therapy clinics. Grace received dozens of letters from parents, teachers, and therapists. One mother from Vermont wrote, "My son doesn't speak much either. He's been carrying your book around like it's a part of him." Grace read the letter aloud to Leo one morning, and though he made no sound, she swore he blinked slower than usual, as if he too understood the weight of it, with the royalties. Grace donated to a local center that offered therapy for children with autism. The donation helped fund a new sensory room, quiet, soft-lit, full of weighted blankets and storybooks, including one very special title on the shelf, Still. Life at home remained deeply personal. Each afternoon, when Finn returned from school, he dropped his backpack by the door, ran outside, and threw his arms around Leo's neck. Buddy circled them, tail wagging, barking his excitement. Then they all sat beneath the trees until dinner. The boy, the lion, and the dog. An image so familiar now that it almost seemed normal, but nothing could have prepared Grace for what happened that bright April morning. It was a Sunday. The air smelled like thawed earth and pine needles. Grace was planting herbs in a wooden box near the back porch when she heard it. A sound like rustling, but slower, heavier. Leo had been lying nearby, basking in the warmth, but now he stood, alert, ears forward. From the edge of the trees, another lion stepped into view, smaller, thinner, with a darker mane beginning to form around his neck. He moved cautiously, but with purpose, his golden-brown eyes scanning the yard. Grace stood frozen, the trowel in her hand forgotten. Leo let out a low chuff, not a growl, not a warning, but something like recognition. The younger lion stepped closer, then stopped a few feet away. Leo approached him slowly, tail low, body relaxed. The two touched noses, then pressed their foreheads together. It was unmistakable. Siblings. Grace's breath caught, her eyes stung. The new lion, narrower in the shoulders, with a jagged scar above one eye, was Leo's brother. Perhaps from the same circus. Perhaps separated long ago. And yet, somehow, Leo had found him. Or he had found Leo. It didn't matter how. Leo turned to Grace. For a long moment, he simply looked at her, then stepped aside, allowing the younger lion to move forward. The message was clear. He trusts you. Grace knelt, tears sliding silently down her cheeks. The younger lion paused, cautious but curious. And then, in a gesture almost too human, he sat beside her. From the kitchen window, Finn watched. Then he picked up his sketch pad. That autumn, long after the Lion brothers had settled into their rhythm and the days grew shorter, Finn presented Grace with a drawing. It showed 5 figures beneath a golden tree, its leaves falling like confetti. A woman with red hair, a boy in a sweater, a dog with a crooked tail, and 2 lions, one proud and tall, the other smaller, nestled close. In the corner, in Finn's neat handwriting, was a single word. Home. Sometimes. Miracles don't roar from mountaintops. Sometimes they arrive quietly, on 4 paws, beneath a broken branch, in the voice of a child who finally finds the courage to speak. The Lion Who Waited is not just a story about a wild animal who stayed. It's about the kind of love that heals, the kind of loyalty that doesn't leave, and the kind of grace that can only come from something greater than ourselves. In a world that often feels cold and uncertain, this story reminds us that God's blessings can take many forms. Sometimes, they arrive wrapped in fur and silence. Sometimes, they live in the heart of a child. And sometimes, they walk beside us, watching over our homes like a quiet guardian. If you believe in the power of second chances, in quiet miracles, and in the goodness God still places in this world, please share this story with someone who might need it. Leave a comment below to tell us how this touched your heart. And if you felt God's presence in Leo's journey, we invite you to write just one word, Amen. Don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and may God bless you and your family with protection, healing, and hope in unexpected places.